Hello and welcome to my presentation on value-based pricing policies for new medicines, an experimental approach. This video is a recorded training version of my PhD defense, which I will be giving in 3 days. Fingers crossed. I begin with the overarching research goal, which was to answer the question how established research in experimental economics could help inform current policy reform discussions on the pricing of new patent-protected medicines. Economic laboratory experiments take place in a controlled setting where participants, usually selected from a standard population, performed simplified tasks incentivized by real monetary rewards. One of the main advantages of lab experiments is the possibility of tight control and measurability of the independent and dependent variables. This allows interventions to be tested under ceteris paribus conditions. Policy research on the regulation of pharmaceutical pricing, on the other hand, is currently mainly based on the analysis of available price data, published government documents, political essays, and qualitative expert surveys. As our first study showed, which I will not discuss in detail here, the evidence on the effectiveness of pricing policies to reach societal goals is still very limited. The problem is that effective prices for new medicines in many countries today are confidential and therefore rarely available for research. And even for established therapies where data are available, few quantitative analyses manage to control policy interventions for the many confounding variables, like other policy measures, economic and technological changes, country specifics, etc. In the past decade, lab experiments have brought a lot of insights on how individuals take decisions, also in healthcare. They have proven to be a valuable complement to other research methods, especially when evidence from the field is difficult to collect. However, lab experiments have not been applied to pharmaceutical pricing negotiations so far. So the ambitious aim was to bridge these two completely separated discourses. 4 studies were conducted for this purpose: a systematic literature review of the existing evidence on the effectiveness of price regulations, and 3 experimental studies that built on each other. The entire approach is finally laid out in an introductory chapter of the dissertation. In the following presentation, the aim is to justify the entire research approach and make it understandable. For this reason, I focus on the last, concluding one of the 4 studies conducted. Details on the experimental procedure and the underlying behavior model are saved for discussion. I'll start right away with a very general and selective summary of the current challenges in pharmaceutical pricing to highlight the need for research. From a theoretical point of view, it is important to mention that the pricing of new patent-protected medicines takes place in a bilateral oligopoly or monopoly. This is one of the reasons why lengthy negotiations can occur, as there is no competitive market price, but a range of possible prices where both parties are better off with an agreement than without one. Another challenge visualized here in the picture, generally in healthcare and especially in the market for prescription drugs, is that the demand side is divided into several parties. One of the main challenges from a practical perspective comes from the economic and technological change of the regulated market. Over the past 2 decades, the focus of the research-based pharma industry has shifted from a large patient population and potential blockbusters to smaller, very specific patient groups and indications. At the same time, an impressive advance in pharmaceutical technology took place. Both were accompanied by a significant increase in annual treatment costs of specialty pharmaceuticals. Aside of the general challenge to assess and reward the clinical benefit of new innovative treatment options, there is an increased discussion on how to address the often limited certainty on real-world benefit of them at market entry. And finally, as you can see on the picture on the right side, challenging price negotiations come at the cost of reduced patient access. The red shaded area here indicates the share of approved treatments in European countries which are not available for patients. These are some of the reasons why industry, regulators, and payers are increasingly expressing concern that current pricing policies are no longer sufficiently capable of rewarding true scientific progress, promoting value for money, as well as timely patient access, while ensuring sustainable healthcare spending. Here is an attempt to visualize the policy research field from a policy design perspective. In most OECD countries, whenever a pharmaceutical product comes to market, there are public pricing rules in place which regulate the price setting for the new therapy. These policies vary substantially between countries. However, the most common policies can be summarized in 3 groups. With external reference pricing, the price in the respective country is simply based on the available list price in other countries. For established therapies, it's also possible to compare the new product with the price of available alternatives in the same chemical class in the respective market. And then in the last 15 years, several countries have implemented forms of value-based pricing. It implies that the price for a new therapy is based on the value it promises for patients and the health system. And in general, industry payers and regulators seem to share the expectation that value-based pricing could improve patient access to and value for money of new treatments. Every policy measure has, of course, intended and unintended effects, and concerns related to certain of these effects and the trends in the market I've mentioned before have led to numerous policy reform projects in OECD countries. In the 6 years after the financial crisis 2008, over 500 policy interventions have been implemented in the EU countries alone. From an evidence-based policy perspective, any reform effort should first put efforts in gathering evidence on the effects of implemented policies. This not least because any adjustment of current reimbursement policies potentially has a relevant impact on short-term market access strategies of local market authorization holders, and in larger markets, even on long-term R&D investment strategies of international companies. So by a common definition, policy design begins with the analysis of the abilities of policy tools to trigger behavior mechanism among target groups in order to affect policy outcomes. The added value offered by experimental economics is that the effects of institutional changes on the price formation process and the associated behavior of the decision makers involved can be studied in a controlled setting. Although this has not yet been used for the setting of interest here, there are many promising experimental designs for other decision situations that have been tested and published in recent decades. There are experimental studies available on investment decisions and insurance choice. These are, however, of less interest here. A lot of experiments have been conducted in the field and the lab on health-related decisions of healthy individuals and patients. Outside of health economics, there is a large body of experimental research on the behavior of sellers and buyers in trading interactions. There is a growing body of experimentation on the behavior of treating physicians on the different reimbursement systems. Some of them have broadened the scope to include a third-party payer. And historically, there has generally been a large body of experimental evidence on social preferences in decision-making that has recently been applied to health economics. Now, this simple yet ambitious idea was to build on these designs and incorporate elements of them to explore the interaction between the seller and buyer of a new option to improve patient benefit, considering the financial consequences of the decision for a third-party payer and an initial investor. The decision situation in the experiment was set up as follows. 367 university students were randomly assigned to the role of a seller or a buyer. All players received the same instructions except for the role-specific wording, and they also had the same payoff function. They were instructed for a negotiation that could generate real patient benefit. This was done via donations after the experiment to the cancer patient organization Krebsliga Schweiz. All knew that the object of negotiation had been financed by a passive player in the role of an investor, at an unknown amount. They further knew that if an agreement was reached, a passive player in the role of the payer would have to pay the selling price to the investor. During the game, players had to simultaneously state final price offers without knowing the counteroffer. If the seller's offer was equal to or lower than the buyer's purchase offer, an agreement was reached. Consequently, the patient benefit achieved was transferred to the cancer patient organization. The negotiated price was the average of the two offers. For example, if the sales offer was 4 and the purchasing offer was 6, an agreement was reached at the price of 5. And at the end of the experiment, this price was transferred from the payer's initial capital to the investor. In the second and third experiments, the player's salaries depended on the negotiation outcome and the price achieved. And in the third experiment, this salary was determined by the two passive principles, depending on the outcome of the negotiation. If no agreement was achieved, the patient benefit on the negotiation was not transferred to the patient organization. However, to simulate real-world reimbursement negotiations, where standard therapy is often available to the patient, an alternative known to the players was donated to the patient organization in case of non-agreement. The experiment was designed so that rational negotiators with social preferences should prefer a successful negotiation to the alternative in the majority of games. Let's take a look at the two value-based interventions in the third experimental study. As in the two previous experiments, participants were confronted with an existing alternative to provide benefit to the patient. Here with the benefit of 2 Swiss francs at the cost of 4 francs to the payer. In each decision situation, they had to make a final price offer for a new option to benefit the patient. In contrast to the previous experiment, the exact amount of the patient benefit of the new option was not known. It was only known that it would be between 0 and 10 francs. The effective amount would be determined by lottery at the end of the experiment. This design element was introduced to simulate the mentioned uncertainty of real-world effectiveness in real-world reimbursement negotiations. While the participants in the control group only had to agree on a final price offer, in the risk-sharing group, they also had to agree on an expected or promised patient outcome. If they agreed on a reimbursement price, but the final patient outcome was below their agreed expectation, the reimbursement price was reduced by half. In this way, they were forced to share a disappointing patient outcome equally. Participants in the cost-benefit group similarly had to form an expectation regarding patient outcome, however, only for themselves. Unlike the other two groups, they were introduced to the concept of cost-benefit. So here, cost of 4 francs for a benefit of 2 corresponds to a cost of 2 francs for 1 franc transferred to the patient. The key figure was automatically calculated for the available alternative, as well as for each possible price they typed in for the new option. They could, of course, ignore this information. Now let's look at the experimental results. On the vertical here, you can see the 7 offer games that participants played. In green, the average price offer per game of the sellers. In blue, that of the buyers. In the table below here, you can also see the available alternative in each game in case of no agreement. You will recall that the alternative simulated an existing standard of care in the real world. In most games, this was worse for the patient than the negotiated option with expected value of 5. In most games, it was most probably also worse in terms of value for money, but we can elaborate on this in the discussion. The first offer game was the only one without an alternative. This was played twice at the beginning and at the end. Now, as you can easily see, only in the last game, the selling prices in the control group were not significantly higher than the buying prices. In all other games, no agreement was possible between the average negotiators. If we now look at the two intervention groups, we see a comparable picture in the risk-sharing group. However, things look better in the cost-benefit group. Here, the average price offers prevented an agreement only in 2 games. We do not know the actual distributional preferences of the average player. However, if we look at the available alternative, the failure in game 7 could be due to the higher patient benefit in case of non-agreement. At least this was the only game in which the patient benefited more from the failure of a negotiation with 6 francs than from the lottery with an expected value of 5. Less comprehensible seems to be the failure in game 3 in these 2 groups, where the patient benefit was significantly lower with 1 franc than the expected value of the lottery. Looking at the average price offers in the group side by side, we can clearly see that the players changed their price offer for the same negotiated patient benefit due to the different alternatives. However, the regression also showed that this effect was less pronounced in the cost-benefit group, respectively more pronounced in players that were not assigned to the cost-benefit group. Interestingly, looking at different regression models, it could be shown that it was not the price or benefit of the alternative alone, but their ratio, the price-benefit, or inverse value for money, that had the highest explanatory power. Now, we are of course not only interested in the average offer behavior, but above all in the actual negotiation outcome when the individual offers meet. In the experiment, random negotiation pairs were formed at the end in each group for this purpose to determine the true payoffs for the participants and the patient organization. For statistical analysis, the procedure was repeated to obtain a representative sample from the large number of possible permutations of pairs per group. The results per group presented here now include both successful negotiation results and failed ones in which the alternative was applied. With this, we now also see the effect of the risk sharing on reimbursement prices, which was not the case with the individual offers before. The reimbursement prices here on the left in the risk sharing group were significantly lower than in the control group. However, the risk sharing group also realized a lower patient benefit than the other 2 groups. The negative effect on patient benefit outweighs the cost containment effect, which is why the group achieved a significantly lower value for money than the cost benefit group. It appears that the cost benefit group also performed better than the control group. However, this difference was unfortunately not significant in the majority of the pairing variations. Just a very brief interpretation of the results. We can then expand on that in the discussion. First, on the influence of the existing alternative to an agreement. As mentioned above, it may be that at least in some games, a non-agreement corresponded to the preferences of an average player. However, based on the underlying model, the design was such that a rational player with social preferences should have preferred an agreement to negotiation failure in the majority of games. Based on the available experimental research and behavior economic theory, the following explanations are offered. First, anchoring effects are generally very well documented. Individuals can be influenced in price decisions by existing price anchors. Specific to the observed offer gaps, research suggests that depending on the design of a trading situation, individuals tend to avoid possible future regret over a bad decision, which can hinder trading. Similarly, uncertainties about the negotiation and its outcome seem to have a trade inhibiting effect. Finally, a number of experiments suggest that sellers and buyers focus on different information of the decision situation, which also seems to have a negative impact on trading success. One possible explanation for the contrasting effects of the 2 interventions could be that by focusing on the value-based key figure, participants were able to reduce perceived uncertainty, aversions to a bad deal, and role-specific differences in focus. In the past, experiments have also shown that individuals use simplifying heuristics as decision-making aids. The common positively formulated valuation indicator might have both reduced the anchor effect and facilitated an agreement. The mandatory risk sharing may have had the opposite effect. This brings me finally to some initial conclusions for policy design, which also include some broader reflections. Value-based pricing in the sense of guiding price negotiations by concepts that relate the price to the expected patient benefit could have a beneficial effect on patient access as well as value for money of new therapies. A shared valuation framework may be superior to binding performance-based guarantees, even in the face of uncertain real-world effectiveness. Uncertainty could be addressed through so-called coverage with evidence development schemes, combined with regular price reviews. For countries like Switzerland, this would suggest reforming the existing pricing regulation, which currently focuses on external and therapeutic reference pricing. Recently published recommendations to define an extended valuation framework that considers additional elements could be promising, also for further experimental research based on the presented approach. Finally, the observed anchoring effects suggest that internal floor or ceiling prices may have a negative impact on patient access and value for money. This practice, particularly prevalent in the pharma industry, would thus contradict public statements that the company's strategy is geared toward contributing to a value-based healthcare system. With this somewhat idealistic conclusion, I close my presentation and now look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.